Hi, I'm David Brum, the Northwest Museum of Arts and Culture's Programs and Events Manager. I'm here in the museum's exhibit, Witness to Wartime, the painted diary of Taukuchi Fujii, which will be on display at the MAC until Sunday, May 16th. This exhibit chronicles the story of this important Japanese-American modernist artist who left us with a truly compelling visual record of his experience living as a Japanese-American detainee at a Japanese internment camp during World War II. I recently had the opportunity to discuss Fujii's life and artistic achievements within the social and political context of his times with art historian and the exhibit curator, Dr. Barbara Johns. She is also the author of a book about Fujii, The Hope of Another Spring, Taukuchi Fujii, Artist and Wartime Witness. I hope you enjoy our discussion. Thanks for watching.
Morning, Barbara.
Good morning, David. Good morning.
To start us off, can you share with us how you developed your interest in Fujii's life and art and came to tell his story?
I have an unexpected late career after leaving museum practice in researching and studying immigrant generation Japanese American artists in Seattle. And it's just one thing after another. Except for some reviews of Fujii's artwork in the 1930s, there's been almost no information about him, even though he was one of three most prominent artists before World War II. Even major surveys of Asian American art showed only a question mark for his death date. I had written about other immigrant generation Japanese American artists, as I mentioned, and I was beginning a third study when, out of the blue, pure serendipity, I was introduced online to Fujii's grandson, Sandy Kita. Sandy is a scholar of Japanese art, and he was in the process of translating his grandfather's diary from the war. I had research to do in Washington, D.C., near Sandy's home. Went to visit Sandy and his wife, Terry, and they showed me what they had. The diary, well over 100 paintings and drawings from the beginning of World War II until the end of the artist's life in 1964. Twice as many as appear in the exhibition. None had been seen outside the family. It was a stunning scene, and they readily agreed when I proposed an exhibition. The whole project then grew far beyond in both magnitude of, say, the exhibition, the tour, the book, and the importance of this find that we were able to show. But finding that work was really only the beginning. Nothing is dated or titled, and all the sorting, identifying the subjects, and beginning to understand what I was seeing took months, even years. A number of the watercolors can be matched with diary entries. And even though there's a often brief text with that diary identifying it, but even so, understanding the fuller context and meaning of an image or a diary entry has really literally taken me several years and would go on. At first I didn't understand the importance of the diary. I'm a modernist as an art historian. It took a historian of Japanese America to point out the detail and particularities of the Issei perspective that the diary brings, the fullness and detail of that account, and its as well as its first generation perspective. And as I mentioned, I continue to learn. I mean, the more I read of Japanese American history, the more I can see in Fujii's work. And I look at something and say, that's in the picture. It's an ongoing process.
Thank you. So another question is, with the recent increase in instances of violent attacks and surges of abuse on Asian Americans here in the United States, would you elaborate on racism and discrimination Fujii experienced and explain why, in some ways, the history of Japanese American confinement during World War II is not as widely known as many of us feel it should be. And what lessons can this period in our history teach us?
It's a big question, David. Um, the forced exclusion and confinement of Japanese Americans on the West Coast, if you pointed out, was in a way the culmination of decades of anti-Asian movement. And to go back even further, uh, Isabel Wilkerson, in her recent book Caste, points out that people have always needed to see themselves above someone else. And race, as we call it, a construction, is a readily visible difference to separate any people from another. When immigration from Japan began in the late 19th century, one of the fiercest voices leading the anti-Japanese movement was an immigrant himself, one from Czechoslovakia. This was in San Francisco Bay Area. But the anti-Japanese movement followed a history of anti-Asian agitation, as I mentioned. Workers had been brought from China to help build the railroads across the country. But as they began to settle, they met increasing resistance to any kind of permanent settlement. And the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 barred any further Chinese immigration. And it was the first significant law to restrict immigration to the US. The movement grew by fits and starts, fed by fear of economic competition. And step by step, immigrants from Japan were denied rights to own or lease land, to become citizens. They could not legally become citizens had they immigrated, until finally it culminated in the mass exclusion of all people of Japanese descent on the West Coast. And that included not only the immigrant generation, but also the second and third generations, their American-born children and grandchildren who are American citizens by birthright. With the forced exclusion, then really shows that our institutions, our democratic institutions, are not immune from mistakes or abuse. 40 years after the orders for the mass exclusion and the confinement of Japanese Americans, a congressional investigation concluded that the root causes were racism, wartime hysteria, and a failure of leadership at all three levels of government: the executive, Congress, and the Supreme Court. And so, as you highlight rightly, the recent murders of people of Asian American descent, the ongoing killings of Black Americans, the anti-Muslim reaction to 9/11, the anguish about immigration, all make clear that these issues are still very much with us. And they show how easy it is to target and vilify an entire group who's different.
Most of us who'll be watching this video reside in Spokane and in the Northwest. With that in mind, how does Fujii's story relate to us here?
Actually, there's some really interesting connections. Spokane was a major settlement of immigrant generation Japanese from the early period of immigration, about 1890 to 1910. They were recruited, they came to help build the railroads, work in the mines. Some of them dispersed and farmed and settled. Always there were small businessmen who provided goods and services. And by about 1910, there was a population of some 1,000 people of Japanese descent in Spokane. With the federal laws barring naturalization, restricting any further immigration by 1924, by the 30s, combined with the Depression, the population sank to some 300. But with World War II and the declaration that the West Coast would become an exclusion zone. Now, that exclusion zone was just the western half of Washington and Oregon. all of California and the southern part of Arizona. People on the coast began moving inland when they could. Some chose to do that. And the population, Japanese, Japanese population in Spokane jumped during the war, before and during the war, or just right as the wars began, to again about 1,000. Became one of the most prominent Spokane citizens, was among those who left Minidoka to settle in Spokane, and he left it during the war. Ed Tsutakawa. He was an artist, a businessman, a civic leader in Spokane. He died in just 2006. So I imagine many of your members and viewers knew him. I did not. I knew his Seattle family. And there's a garden today named in his honor. He was the founder of the Japanese Spokane Sister City program. Another very well-known artist who came there just during the war, Paul Horiyuchi, then moved back on to Seattle. But Spokane during World War II was really an important home base for many people of Japanese descent.
And those gardens are beautiful too. So,
yeah, I look forward to seeing them.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Johns, for sharing your professional and personal experience about the life and art of Fujii. For those watching who would like to learn more about Mr. Fujii and his art, Dr. Johns will be giving a virtual Zoom lecture on Thursday evening, April 29th, beginning at 6:30 p.m. For more information on this exhibit and information how to register for Dr. Johns' talk, visit the museum website at www.northwestmuseum.org. Hope to see you soon at the museum.